Okay, so let's get to the second argument, and that is Tooley's argument on the right to life. How close is this in the book to the other one? So we are now on Tooley. Where are you? So we're in chapter 73 on page 275 in the textbook. This one's a little bit longer. And it's another one of those kind of repetitive arguments. But again, remember, repetitiveness in a deductive argument is to promote clarity, because it's very important that different premises say the same thing, especially for these modus ponens type things. So let's just go through this one. Oh, and so you'll notice the textbook calls it Tooley on abortion and infanticide. That is specifically what the argument's about, but it has a more general application than that. And if you look at it, these early premises make it very clear that it's talking about a more general principle, and then applying that specifically to the topic of fetuses, young infants, and so forth. Okay, premise one. If A has a morally serious right to X, then A must be able to want X. Premise 2. If A is able to want X, then A must be able to conceive of X. Conclusion 1. If A has a morally serious right to X, then A must be able to conceive of X. That's a very abstract but a very simple modus ponens. It's just trying to give a definition of what it takes to have a right. And the definition given here is that if you have a morally serious right to something, then you have to be able to think of it as a right. You have to be able to form some intentions about that thing. Premise 3. Fetuses, young infants, and animals cannot conceive of their continuing as subjects of mental states. Conclusion 2. Fetuses, young infants, and animals cannot want their continuing as subjects of mental states. Conclusion 3. Fetuses, young infants, and animals do not have a morally serious right to continue as the subject of mental states. Okay, so this is building on conclusion 1 and then just adding this premise, which, I assume that Tooley thinks you can demonstrate, that fetuses, young infants, and animals simply do not have the mental sophistication to conceive of themselves as continuing to exist, right? They're kind of stuck in the present, as it were. They don't think into the future. They may not even think into the past at all. They just sort of exist in the present and experience things and react to them. That's kind of the picture that we're getting here. Or even if they can sort of think a little bit into the past, they have memories, think a little bit into the future, they can predict stuff. They don't think of themselves continuing into the future. They don't identify themselves as a specific object, which is different in the right types of ways from the rest of the world. So you can see that this premise has a lot of empirical assumptions, scientific assumptions in it about the mental sophistication of fetuses, young infants, and animals. So the fact that they can't conceive of these things, they can't want them, means that, according to Tooley, fetuses, young infants, and animals do not have a morally serious right to continue as the subject of mental states. Premise 4. If something does not have a morally serious right to life, then it is not wrong to kill it painlessly. So we've got a little bit of a change in phrasing here. A morally serious right to continue as the subject of mental states, that is translated in premise 4 to being morally serious right to life. So right to continue as the subject of mental states and right to life are taken to be identical here in Tooley's argument. So if something does not have a morally serious right to life, then it is not wrong to kill it painlessly. And then the final conclusion that is that it is not wrong to kill fetuses, young infants, and animals painlessly. So that's Tooley's argument. So you can see this is about more than abortion and infanticide, although that's what the title of the chapter suggests, it's also about the moral status of animals, right? So this is a bit contrary to what we just saw here. This says that animals have moral status if marginal humans do. Now, and it concludes that, in fact, marginal humans have status, therefore so do animals. Here, so we can think of fetuses and young infants as marginal humans, right? And essentially that's what Tooley is doing here. He's giving us a definition not of what it is to be human, but of what it is to have morally serious rights. And presumably this applies to adult humans. So things which are genetically human but don't have this ability then are marginal humans. So Tooley's definition of marginal humans will be any genetically human creature that is not capable of conceiving of their continuing as a subject of mental states, right? So that's why I've renamed this to be a bit broader. So as I said, we can think of this as an example of biting the bullet. His example of what a morally serious right is very demanding, right? The ability to conceive of things at this kind of abstract level, right? You have to be able to think of yourself as an individual creature that has things which are beliefs, desires, and so forth. So it may be that young children and even animals can think of themselves as a distinct object from the rest of the world. In fact, you might think they have to be able to navigate in any kind of way, or to differentiate themselves from like playmates or predators, things like that. But even if they can do that, Tooley's going to say what they can't do is that they don't have these mental concepts of being the subject of mental states. They don't have the concept of mental states. They don't have the concept of belief, desire, and so forth. Because they don't have those very sophisticated concepts, they don't have a right to life. Now, the kind of question for Tooley here would be, well, is this too demanding, right? And that, I guess that's kind of an empirical claim, right? And when I say that, I mean we have to do scientific study and experiments in psychology, neurology, things like that, to figure out whether or not young humans and animals have these concepts. Now, also importantly, he says he says fetuses and young infants. I mean, at what point do these fairly complicated cognitive abilities arise in human beings? Is this such a demanding claim on the cognition of a creature in order to have a morally serious right that you don't have this until you're a teenager, right? You might think that if that were the conclusion and that therefore it was okay to kill human beings painlessly, just without asking them, without being worried about it until they're like 18, you might think that's obviously far too extreme of a view. You might think that counterintuitive consequence shows that there's something awfully wrong with Tooley's argument. And that's kind of the problem of it being so hostage to these empirical claims. He thinks that it's only limited to young infants. He doesn't give us an age limit for that, but presumably not older than 2. So Tooley's going to say, well, from conception until 2 years old, it's perfectly acceptable to kill human beings painlessly. Don't worry about it, right? I mean, when I say acceptable, I mean it's morally okay. Obviously, people aren't going to be okay with it, but it's not going to be practically acceptable. It's not legally acceptable, but he's going to say morally there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, so I'm just pointing out how extreme of an argument this is, and I'm sure you didn't need my help with that. Now, as I've been indicating, the details are incredibly important here. So when I said that it's hostage to empirical results, that's what I'm saying here in this first bullet point. that his argument ties him to empirical vicissitude. Vicissitude just means changes, like frequent and small changes. So it may turn out that some non-human animals can conceive of and want things, and it may turn out that young infants and fetuses can conceive of and want things. And that may come mix and match. So it might turn out that no young of any species can do it, but that adult animals can, whereas immature humans still can't. So that would mean that adult animals, say, full-grown dogs, full-grown chimpanzees and gorillas, they might have a serious right to life on this view, while at the same time, human children from conception to two don't have a right to life. That's perfectly possible, the way that TOOLEY'S put together his premises. We could find scientifically that the distribution and the development of cognitive abilities works out like that. And of course, we have to figure out what exactly conceive of and want means. So those aren't scientific terms. Those are terms of folk psychology at best, right? These sort of intuitive things. So you don't have to be a psychologist to talk about beliefs and desires. Psychologists sort of take those words from normal language and then try and make them scientifically precise. So conceive of and want, these are maybe a little bit vague, right? If you over-intellectualize them, that is, you make them very demanding, you make them very narrow, then it's going to turn out that not even all adult humans can do this. And so it's going to turn out that you can kill almost everyone with no moral problem. And of course, that's an extremely counterintuitive result. On the other hand, if you make it too easy, as it were, you include no cognitive sophistication in what it takes to want things, then it may be that not only do infants, fetuses, and animals have it, it might even be that some non-animals have it, right? If you just make it in terms of, so think of a plant. Think of phototropic and gravitropic plants. That is, phototropic plants, plants that grow towards the light. You might think, oh, the plant wants that light, right? If you make the concept of want permissive enough, now we're going to say, oh, well, these plants have a serious right to life too. And people are going to think, at least most people are going to think, well, that's too far in the other direction. So it's incredibly important that we get good definitions of this, and we don't really get that from TOOLEY. So there's that problem. Further, TOOLEY specifically talks about serious moral status. He still leaves specifically fetuses, young infants, and animals with some kind of non-serious moral status. Because, if you'll notice in the conclusion, it is not wrong to kill fetuses, young infants, and animals painlessly, right? So if something does not have a morally serious right to life, then it is not wrong to kill it painlessly. Presumably that's put in there because it would still be wrong to kill them painfully. So you can see that TOOLEY definitely thinks that sentience, that is the ability to feel pain, to have experiences, that's not enough for a serious moral right. But it's enough for a non-serious one, whatever that means. Because even though you can kill them non-painlessly and not worry about it, if you kill them painfully, then you've done something wrong. Okay? So it's a very, sophisticated is going to sound like the wrong word because it sounds kind of barbaric. It's a very nuanced picture here. So it's wrong in some sense, it's wrong in some moral sense, not in just a practical sense, to inflict pain, according to TOOLEY'S arguments, on fetuses, young infants, and non-human animals. But it is not wrong to straight up kill them as long as you don't inflict pain on them. So they still have some kind of moral status. It's just diminished compared to, presumably, fully grown human beings, fully cognitively mature human beings who can think of themselves in this way, who are cognitively sophisticated. You cannot kill them at all, painlessly or not, without doing something wrong, according to TOOLEY'S argument. So Whereas you go through the argument once, you might think, well, it says these kind of weird and perhaps obviously wrong things. When you go through it second time and you go through it carefully, you see that it says a very complicated and not straightforward set of things about when it is okay to kill certain entities. And again, it's complicated because it depends a great deal on scientific facts about cognitive sophistication. Now, as it turns out, the more that we do research on non-human animals, again, specifically adult non-human animals, the more we find that a lot of them are very cognitively sophisticated. To the point that in some jurisdictions, there are some non-human animals who are accorded the legal status of person, meaning that they, that there are certain laws which apply to them specifically and also human beings because of their cognitive sophistication. So sometimes these laws are passed symbolically, but there are certain jurisdictions in which higher primates, that is chimpanzees and gorillas, are legally persons, and there are some places, some jurisdictions, in which technically dolphins are legal persons because they have been seen to be cognitively, socially sophisticated enough to warrant that characteristic, that right, something like that. So this is a very difficult argument to figure out what exactly it entails in the real world. It's fairly clear what it means logically, but there are some little nuances in it. For instance, this difference between non-serious and serious moral rights that it implies, but then doesn't really tell us anything about, right? So the first argument is a little bit more cut and dried in that way. It just talks about moral status. It doesn't talk about serious and non-serious, just moral status. Do we think this difference between a serious and a non-serious moral status is actually there? What do we make of this difference? That's something that TOOLEY'S argument kind of brings up, but then doesn't close on for us. Okay, so as I said, these are probably things which you have more thoughts about, more opinions about already before having started doing philosophy. Hopefully, that will make the discussion more interesting and make your assignments more interesting. So as I said, for the reading sequence assignments, that is for the active reading, for the individual summary, and for the group discussion, you will be looking at specifically and only textbook chapter 70. And that's the ethical vegetarian argument. When you're thinking about this kind of stuff, it's perfect. You should consider what we've looked at in the lecture today. That should inform what you're thinking about. And you might even specifically mention it, say, in the group discussion. But in the individual summary and the active reading, the only place that you would mention it would be, say, in the analysis part of the summary, right? When you are summarizing the Chapter 70 article itself, only talk about the Chapter 70 article, right? When you are doing the active reading and evaluating the questions or giving your answers both before and after, evaluate only those answers with respect to the Chapter 70 reading. In the analysis part of the individual summary, when you're trying to say, well, here's how well I thought the argument succeeded, then you might mention this other stuff we talked about and say, well, it doesn't look like this argument has taken into account this stuff about moral status in the right way, so on and so forth. That's fine. And of course, in your group discussions, as long as you're addressing those questions, you can put in whatever extra considerations you feel are necessary. Right, so if you have any questions about this, please feel free to email me. I will be recording later today the recap for week 3. The week 3 feedback and grades are all up, which includes the feedback and grades for your thesis articulation assignment. You'll notice, well, I'll go over this in the summary, but you'll notice that there's a difference in your feedback for the standard weekly assignments this week, and I'll explain that in the recap.